I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to start by responding to a couple of viewer comments on my last episode, Are You Ready to Save the World? And in that, I'm going to talk about the Theodicy Triangle and why these ancient questions of theology are so critical for how we are responding to things like the pandemic or to Ukraine. Then I'll be going to Ukraine with Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson, I think, is the leading geopolitical economist. And he has an article called The U.S. Conquers Germany for the Third Time in a Century. And after that, I'll go to Professor John Mearsheimer, who is from the University of Chicago and is called by Matt Taibbi, someone who is quickly becoming infamous because he is doubling down on predictions that he's been making for a couple of decades. And so we'll go to his 2015 lecture on why Ukraine is the US's fault and not Russia. This, of course, has to be put in perspective for when that was being said. So let's get started. In my last episode, I talk about how there are only three possibilities for ultimate reality as I see it. One is God is a monster who created a world of suffering and death because that's what he's into. Two, there is no God and the world created itself. Three, there is no world and reality exists elsewhere. So I had a viewer named the King Arthur Riza Show who responded and said, oh no, there are other possibilities. This is called the Theodicy Triangle, and theologians have been debating this for centuries, and he talked about some of the possibilities. Now, I pointed out that I have a whole episode called the Theodicy Triangle, and that was my starting point for this whole debate. But I think we have a bias that if dead white men from centuries ago said it, then it can be considered valid, even if it doesn't make sense. And so what I'm doing is adding to that logic and saying, okay, here's how this could be true. And as far as I can see, this is the only way that this could be true. Why are these questions important? My viewer, Melan Innocent, responded that she had read those comments and she said, I honestly just glaze over when I am reading that kind of thing because does God exist, does God not exist? I think of that as not really being very relevant. So here's another dead white man that I quote often. The Anglican theologian J.A.T. Robinson from the 18th century said, God is by definition the ultimate reality. It is pointless to ask whether reality exists. The interesting question is, what is reality like? So if we take God, purpose, and meaning as all having this being synonymous with each other, the question we're asking is, does meaning exist? If we take the authority that was the Catholic Church, for instance, they say that the world was created by God for the purpose of suffering and death. It was created as a punishment. That's what Genesis says. And God put us in charge of that. And then we can go to a different movement that honestly I think is more capitalism, which says God doesn't exist. Meaning doesn't exist. The only meaning that exists is making money. And so that's the default reality that we're accepting. That's the authority that we're accepting when we say either it's that God or it's no God at all. I think we need to develop the possibility that meaning exists, that purpose exists. And that's a critical question for everything we're looking at. Because if we look at the pandemic and we say, okay, this is just something that is a hindrance. These people in power have done these things, and we have to get back in control because there is no one but us to defend us. That would be saying there is no purpose. There is nothing that's on our side. If we look at Ukraine and we say, oh, this is these powers, and they're fighting, and there could be a nuclear war, and that could happen at any time. That again would be saying the world exists for no purpose whatsoever unless it's that purpose of suffering and death that the Bible talks about. Otherwise, it's just chaos. And chaos is something that when Russell Brand interviewed John Abramson, he talks about how it's just very improbable that we could exist as we do without, with just, hoisting ourselves up by monkey genes. And there's also Scott Adams, who is the cartoonist who does Dilbert. Brilliant guy. And he has a book that I think is called God's Chaos, where he makes the same point that we have to look at all the things that exist and how improbable it is that all of this has happened by chance. But we also, I think, need to reject the God is a monster and say, what else is possible? If there's another possibility, someone should be considering it. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Another viewer left and then deleted a comment that said, pro tip, you lost me and 99% of your viewers when you talked about the voice for God and miracles. That sounds a lot like Scientology. And then he mansplained to me what Scientology was about. So, pro tip, if you want to insult someone and make sure you have the last word, if you post a comment and then delete it, it goes to them, but it doesn't leave them any way to get back to you. So, let's restore my street cred with that 99% and get into some hardcore economics and geopolitics. I talk about Michael Hudson extensively in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, because he has invented a term called the FIRE sector. And FIRE stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. And he tracks how we produce nothing in the U.S., relatively so, that everything that the GDP relies on are all of these artificial manipulations. And so in his article about Germany and Ukraine, what he says is that it's not really politicians who are running things, that there are really three sectors that he calls the oligarchic blob. And those are the MIC, the military industrial complex, OGAM, oil, gas, and mining, and then the FIRE sector. So he looks at how those are influenced by what's happening today in Ukraine. And he sees it as really a play against Germany, because Germany is very dependent, along with much of the rest of Europe, on Russian oil. Michael Hudson says that politicians don't really represent their constituents, they represent their contributors. And their campaign contributors are all of these three sectors in the blob who are dispersed within all of the different districts and states. And so it's obvious how the military-industrial complex would be benefiting from war with Russia. But how about the others? When he looks at oil, gas, and mining, what he says is prices are going to soar because cutting off Russian oil from Europe is going to be extremely devastating for them and also for us, unless we happen to own an oil company. And then he looks at the FIRE sector, and that the intention of that is to be able to privatize, to make sure that there is ownership over the dollar area. So having dollar hegemony, the dollar has been the only currency, the petrodollar, in which oil can be bought. And so keeping that monopoly on the dollar is very important to the U.S. So what do the NATO countries, especially Germany, get out of this for having their oil and gas prices jacked up? What will also happen is that the cost of food, especially wheat, which is a major export of Russia, is going to rise. And so for them, there is no gain here. The confiscation of Russia's monetary reserves is another warning sign for anyone who is part of the IMF that if you displease the U.S., that could be gone in an instant. Russia has also talked about holding some of these leaders accountable for the neo-Nazi regime change that happened in 2014. And so if they are going to do that, they need to create an alternative to The Hague. So they also are critical for our ability to impose economic sanctions on Iran, on Syria, on Venezuela. There are a lot of countries that would love to see an alternative to the petrodollar and a different oil bourse, which is what Libya tried to set up. So if they are partnering with China, and if the U.S. is no longer seen as a reliable NATO partner for Europe, then we could be essentially creating a world that is not the one that they have intended. So let's ask a basic question. What is Europe anyway? Europe is called a continent, but I talk about that in my book. In it, I say, does Europe's claim to be a continent has the mark of hubris for a peninsula with only 4% of the world's landmass? In a prime example of politics trumping geography, the arbitrary border between Europe and Asia cuts right through Russia, giving Europe 75% of Russia's people and Asia 75% of Russia's land. Dictionaries fumble to define the word continent because a large contiguous land mass, mostly surrounded by ocean, leaves out Europe. Michael Hudson's prediction is that Putin will withdraw this week, so we will know quickly whether or not that comes true. Now let's go to who Matt Taibbi calls the increasingly infamous Professor John Mearsheimer. Now, Matt Taibbi has lost a little credibility in my book. He has an article called Putin May Have Played Himself, Will We? And it features a very insulting caricature of Putin to start, and then goes into why he has made a shambles of really not being very smart and not being a good military strategist, and none of the soldiers even know what they're doing. And to validate this, he's quoting a BBC writer, a couple of former Russian columnists, and someone from the Center for New American Security, and then videos on YouTube that he doesn't want to link to because none of them have been verified yet. So I am looking at that analysis as something that I want to take with a grain of salt. John Mearsheimer's 2015 talk is called Why is Ukraine the West's Fault? And he gave that at the University of Chicago, where he's a professor. In that, he shows a map of Ukraine, and he shows which parts are more westernized and which parts are Russian-speaking. And then he talks about how in 2008, there was an announcement by NATO that they would welcome inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine. So Georgia was the first where that battle was fought, and it did not go well for Georgia. And then Crimea ended up being where the next battle was fought, and Russia took back Crimea and is not, according to him, ever going to let it go again. So now he sees Ukraine as being something that has been a pawn in this NATO expansion, which he shows as happening in 3 successive waves. After the coup or revolution, whichever you want to call it, the parliament outlaws the Russian language and all minority languages. They impose restrictions on ethnic minorities, which means those who live in the East. And since this is a legacy of Ukraine having had people who defended Germany in World War II, then you can see why there would be so much animosity between the East and the West of Ukraine. So he says that Russia, in that time, doesn't really want to own Ukraine. What they want to do is guarantee different districts a certain amount of independence so that they are not being able to be restricted by the Ukrainian government. And so what he says is that what the U.S. has are economic interests, and what Russia has are security interests, and that security interests are always going to be more important to people, that they are going to be willing to go through more deprivation for a longer amount of time in order to keep their security. So to bring this full circle, if there is meaning and purpose in life, if there is a force that's conspiring with us to bring about the greatest happiness of all people in the shortest amount of time, how could that be working now? I think that, like the pandemic, this situation is such an overreach. It is the kind of thing that may bring about the collapse of the empire without anyone outside to blame, without an enemy, with it only being that jujitsu move where someone's own forward momentum is what flips them. So I think we should not allow anyone to bully us out of looking at meaning and purpose and even attaching words like God to that kind of discussion. And if you're willing to continue with that, here is the Theodicy Triangle episode, and here is a playlist that is on global economics so I can keep my street cred. And I really hope that you subscribe. Thank you.